Hi all, this is the last lecture for the class, so yahoo! The treatment of juvenile offenders. I like to finish on this note because for me this is the most hopeful note. This is where for me there is definitely the most hope and we have the most promising results. So we're going to today do a little bit of overview of the juvenile justice system, a little bit of the history, and then we are going to kind of talk about what we know in terms of what works for those who are under the age of 18 and have committed crimes. So the juvenile justice system, or abbreviated here as JJS, is a relatively new system. It's only a little over about 100 years old, the first juvenile court being established in 1899. Previously, juveniles were treated as adults, and that historically was because juveniles were viewed more as little adults. As of the age of 12, many had to drop out of school, they had to work jobs, people were marrying younger, they had children younger. So it wasn't until later that we kind of discovered the concept of adolescence. So the juvenile justice system was created to address criminal and problem behaviors among children and youth between the ages of about 10 to 18. Under 10, it is extremely rare that kids would get involved with the court system. Not that it doesn't happen, but usually those things are handled in family court, and there would be no kind of we try to keep them in the home system as much as possible, but to handle criminal offenses, status offenses, and abuse and neglect cases. So why did we establish a separate system for juveniles? Well, we kind of feel that juveniles have a different level of culpability as compared to adults. In the early 1900s, or 19th century, we established childhood as a construct, followed by adolescence, kind of those teenage years, where we understood that people were not functioning at adult levels. And there are developmental facets that do confirm these developmental stages. I mean, we know that adolescents are different from adults emotionally, psychologically, and physically. I think back on my teenage self and how I thought about things and how I handled things and the behaviors that I did. And I was like, what was I thinking? But I was a teenager at the time. And that's why, parents dread those teenage years, because you're kind of governed by hormones, impulsivity, things like that. And having this adolescence kind of supports the notion that adolescents are less culpable than adults, meaning that they're not as guilty because they don't necessarily understand the consequences of their crimes in the same way that adults do. And adolescents are more amenable to change than adults. So if we work to intervene and we catch adolescents who are having problem behaviors early enough, we can change them, and it's easier to do that with adolescents than adults. So increasingly, the brain research that we have and the developmental research that we have shows that adolescents really are not, and I emphasize not, little adults. We know from our own experiences, from watching others, from TV shows and movies, that adolescence is a period of intense physical, emotional, and cognitive development. You're often made to have choices under sometimes the worst conditions. Adolescents tend to expose themselves to more risky situations, and we tend to adolescents think of themselves as adults even though they're not, and they tend to estimate their understanding of situations and underestimate the consequences of their actions. And this is further complicated when youth don't have adequate supervision, parenting, they live in disadvantaged neighborhoods, or other high-risk environments where they don't have a lot of social supports to help them and guide them through this difficult time. Adolescents have emotionally charged information, and they react to things more at a gut level than adults, basically meaning that they're more impulsive than adults are. So this is an image of an adolescent brain and the different areas of the brain, which if you took brain and behavior, you probably have learned about. So the parietal lobe, which is responsible for touch, sight, language, it grows until people's early 20s. So it's not, doesn't process information effectively until adulthood. The ventral striatum is the reward center. It's not fully developed in the teenage years. And here, teenagers are more excited by rewards than consequences. So this is like weighing the pros and cons. Teenagers cannot do that adequately because the center of their brain is not adequately developed. The hippocampus, which is the hub of memory and learning, is growing still in adolescence. And so, as opposed to adulthood, the amygdala, which is the emotional core, which we handle kind of our passion, our impulses, our fear, our aggression. Um, it's not fully developed either in adolescence, so adolescents are more impulsive and more apt to react to these feelings and behaviors. And the prefrontal cortex, that's the front part of our brain, basically is our filter and allows us to think before we act. And that is not fully developed until the age of 25, and that makes adolescents more prone to high-risk behaviors. Now think about all the things that you engaged in your adolescence that perhaps now you'd be too scared to do. And I often think back and like, how did I do that? So here there's some MRI images, so you can see the activation centers on the left-hand side is the teenage brain and the right-hand side is the adult brain. So they are even activating different, when processing emotions, that there are different centers of the brain that react. So you can see the prefrontal cortex in the adult brain, which is like the thinking and planning, is activated with the adults, whereas more the amygdala, which if you go back to this slide, is responsible for kind of those gut visceral emotions, is the one that's reacting in the children. So the juvenile justice system was developed to be separate from the adult criminal justice system and to divert children and adolescents there. And so they recognized the need for different responses and emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. So the goal of the juvenile justice system is really to rehabilitate children as opposed to punish them. And the juvenile justice system significantly differs from the criminal justice system in terms of has more informal proceedings. It's confidential, so records are sealed. It's less adversarial, so you're not always necessarily trying to prove the guilt of the youth, but rather kind of working to find out what the best solution is for everybody. And there are different outcomes with an emphasis on providing treatment and help to the youth so that they can rehabilitate themselves. So the juvenile justice system is civil as opposed to criminal system. The goal is rehabilitation as opposed to punishment. In the adult system, it's non-adversarial. It's based on the medical model, and that's kind of based on the brain development and the developmental stages. The family is very significant for if a child is charged as an adult and has to go into adult court, they can no longer speak to their family members. Or family members are not able to participate in the court proceedings. They can't communicate with the lawyer, etc. And in the juvenile justice system, the family is very significant as you try to, in all cases, work with the family to get the kid back at home. The juvenile justice system is private and confidential as opposed to the adult system, which is open. We're doing adjudication versus trial and guilt or innocence. And, the sentencing is broad in terms of we want to monitor the individual as a juvenile and making sure that they're successful as opposed to kind of having a determinate, like, you're getting X number of years and this is what you're going to serve time for. The good news is that you can see that both incarceration rates and arrest rates for all juveniles have significantly decreased. They reached a peak in 1996 and since then have decreased by 70%. So we are locking up many fewer adolescents, but we're also seeing significant lower levels of crime for adolescents. So it's not 100% clear about why that's what's going on, but I think a lot of the focus has been on prevention and intervention planning and getting these high-risk kids before they end up in the juvenile justice system. We've kind of figured out, what are some of the signs and symptoms of kids who are at risk, and we're providing them with services and supports before they get involved in the criminal justice system, which is huge. So the majority of juvenile crimes really are property offenses, so kind of vandalism, things like that. We see about a quarter of them are offenses against other people. So these are assaults, and about 11% are drug law violations, and 27% are public order offenses. Now, if you look at crime across the board, about 16% of all violent crimes are committed by juveniles. 1/3 of all property crimes are by juveniles. Half of all arsons are committed by juveniles. 42% of vandalism is by juveniles. And about 1/3 of theft and burglary cases are also committed by juveniles. So, you see that a lot of the more serious crimes they're not engaging in. It's mostly these kind of like, delinquency crimes, like crimes against property and theft that they're engaging in. So one of the things that we should talk about is juveniles in adult court. And, we saw a big push for this back in the 1980s with our Get Tough on Crime, where people were assuming that juveniles, were culpable. They were committing these horrific crimes, and we were charging them as adults. It's now become easier to try juveniles in adult court, even if they're under the age of 18. In some states, such as Kansas and Vermont, kids as young as 10 can be charged in adult court, depending on the severity of the crime. Um, Now, so in the kind of early 90s, 44 states and DC made laws making it easier to transfer juveniles to the adult court system. Anecdotally, I don't have the data on this, I wasn't able to find it, but it seems that we are paying more attention to the brain research, and we are recognizing that this is really not appropriate, and trying to give juveniles a chance. So you can see that here, this is some data that we were able to gather, that over the last kind of 2 decades, we are seeing fewer and fewer kids who are being transferred to adult court, which is a good thing. One study in the late 90s in Florida found that youth who were transferred to adult prison were 30% more likely to recidivate than youth who stayed in the juvenile system for the same crime. I mean, just looking at these kids on the right, these are all kids who were tried as adults. I mean, those are babies. I mean, what are you doing putting, children like that and trying them as adults? Like, they're not able to talk to their parents. You can see they're scared. Why do juveniles who are sentenced as adults recidivate at higher levels? Largely because of stigma and labeling. They feel a sense of resentment and injustice in the system. There's reinforcement of criminal behavior when they're hanging around older offenders. They have less access to rehabilitation because the adult system is less focused on rehabilitation than punishment. They have decreased access to their family as opposed to the juvenile justice system, where every effort is made to include families. And there are reduced employment opportunities because the records are not sealed. Therefore, they now have this crime on their record forever, permanently. So we talked about that the primary goal of the juvenile justice system is to rehabilitate the youth. And we do that through treatment programs by diminishing risk factors and promoting protective factors, which is kind of what we've been talking about all along in this class. And obviously this is preferable to punishing them, but even in most cases we do try to keep juveniles at home. However, in some cases, kids commit crimes such as murder, where it's not appropriate for them to stay at home, and they do have to be sentenced to some sort of out-of-home placement. And so we do have, juvenile justice halls, which are basically like the juvenile justice correctional system. These are out-of-home placements, and these are punishments for severe delinquent behavior. But relying heavily on these out-of-home placements does have negative consequences. It's much more expensive than working with them in the homes. It increases the number of juveniles in institutions, which are already overcrowded. We don't see as much correction of delinquent behavior, and you'll learn, as we talk about MST, why that's important for them to stay in the home. And we do see higher levels of recidivism when they are placed in these out-of-home juvenile facilities. And so generally the recidivism rate for untreated juvenile offenders, is 50%. And so if 91% in the California Youth Authority were recidivating, there's something about these facilities that's making them more likely to reoffend. So one of the key things, if we do have to have out-of-home placements, is this aftercare. And this is really important because it provides the juvenile offenders with both services and supervision, and it gives them intensive intervention both while they're incarcerated, but really on that return and transition to the community, because that's really the key, turning point for a lot of youth who are kind of sent out of the home, because it's hard to reintegrate. And a lot of the factors, the risk factors that were there before, are still there. And so helping them cope with that, it really works together nicely. So recent literature reviews and meta-analyses, if you remember, our meta-analyses are our big studies where we combine lots of different findings across studies, say that intervention program is effective in reducing delinquency, as long as they target, as we know from our R&R model, dynamic and criminogenic factors. and having a lot of staff contact with the youth using CBT approaches. We need to have, well-designed and well-implemented programs, and we are targeting offenders with the highest risk of recidivism. So everything that we have talked about throughout this course also applies to juvenile offenders. One thing that we are seeing more of is this community restraint. So this is kind of monitoring of the juveniles once they are released from the juvenile facility. And so these include kind of having a parole officer, urine testing, electronic monitoring, making sure kids are employed or in school. Some kids have to be on house arrest, and some are living in halfway houses. The research basically shows that restraining them alone is not effective in reducing recidivism, that it needs to be combined with effective treatment, although it does not lead to more arrests. So, it's not neither good nor bad necessarily, and it is definitely less cost prohibitive than keeping them in a residential facility. So if you have a choice and you can do some sort of community restraint, that's better than putting them in the residential facility. Now, what I want to finish this discussion with is a discussion of MST, which is, basically the most hopeful intervention we have in terms of everything that we've talked about in this course. The results for kids who've gone through these MST programs that are well implemented and developed are really astronomical and can be really life changers. So MST works on the socio-ecological model. It's basically the child is part of this whole community. So you see the child as part of the family, part of their peers, part of the school, neighborhood, and community and culture. And so all of those things interact with the child to kind of either prevent or promote delinquency. And so in order for the child to change, it's not necessarily the child that we have to change, but all those systems in which the child lives in. As a psychologist, oftentimes if somebody has a young child and they bring them to me for treatment, it's not the child that I see, but rather the parent, because it's the environment that needs to change, not so much the child. That's not to say that the adolescents don't hold some responsibility and they themselves shouldn't participate in treatment, but many times, in most cases, the reason that they are involved in the juvenile justice system is not necessarily because of them, but because they're living in more chaotic environments, or they have criminogenic peers or things like that. And that's not working, kind of with them. So we want to make sure that we work with their families to decrease those risk factors. So with MST, what happens is the therapists actually go and spend 40 hours a week with families and teaching them how to deal with their kids in a more effective manner, teaching them appropriate, reinforcement and punishment techniques. And you're doing a thorough analysis. So you're seeing like what is going on with the peers, what's going on with the school. And so all these systems are going to be working together to help that youth. And they're doing it in the youth's natural environment. So a lot of our treatment programs we talked about are happening in prison. But here we're actually going into the youth's home. We're going into the youth's school. We're working with the teachers. And that really does make a difference. So we see that by improving family functioning, that we are seeing improvements with peers, with school, with community, and that leads to decreases in reoffending. A major focus of MST is working with the parents to enhance their ability to monitor and manage their children's behavior, give effective rewards and consequences. And so if the parents themselves have problems, like the parents themselves have economic problems, they have drug problems, they have mental health problems, the MST therapist works with the parents and gets them services that they need to help them deal with those issues so that they can be there with their kids. Because we find that kids who end up delinquent and using drugs often come from families that have low monitoring, meaning they don't provide adequate supervision for their kids. They have low affection, and they have high levels of conflict. We also see low school involvement and poor academic performance, which then leads the kids to engage with delinquent peers and then delinquent behavior. So by changing those things, by getting the family more involved, by increasing parental monitoring, parental affection, and helping the family manage conflict more effectively, in essence, we are kind of changing this cycle and breaking it and letting the child kind of have a second chance. MST kind of has extraordinary outcomes, and it's been very well researched using RCTs that we read about, the randomized controlled trials. MST has been found to be effective at reducing the number of rearrests, the number of days of incarceration. violence towards peers, increasing family cohesion, and the number of youth who doesn't recidivate at all. In one randomized control trial, meaning they say you go here, of 200, like one group got the treatment as usual, one group got the MST, of 200 juvenile offenders. Those who in the MST group recidivated at 22% versus those who got treatment as usual, which was individual therapy, recidivated at 71% over 4 years. So if you think back to that California statistic where we saw 91% of all juveniles who in the California Youth Authority who reoffended, we are now down to 22% over 4 years, which is pretty incredible. So one comprehensive meta-analysis of 11,958 cases who completed MST treatment found that 90% of the kids were at home, 86% of the kids were in school or working, and 86% of the kids who participated in MST had no further